Hello, and welcome to Oxford Road Presents The Divided States of Media. I'm your host, Dan Granger, founder and CEO of LA-based ad agency Oxford Road. Let me give you a quick lay of the land to kick off our endeavor with this podcast. Culturally, politically, and economically, America is fractured. It's August 2020. In about 75 days, we'll be heading into the most polarizing election in modern history, and one that is begging to be contested. So 38% of Americans already do not believe that this election will be handled fairly, and that's even before the first ballot has been cast. We live in a country right now that features the word united in its name, and yet almost every major issue affecting our lives finds us divided along party lines. Well beyond the president we vote for, it's now the news outlets we follow, the way we deal with the deadly virus, our position on the post office, even the brands that we support. Somehow everything feels partisan. Now, this program at its core is about marketing, and these days it's hard out there for a brand. Many entrepreneurs and corporate citizens are living in fear as they struggle to stay afloat, while over 100,000 small businesses have already gone out of business forever since the pandemic. And many more businesses now face growing pressure from consumers to choose a side on controversial matters. In fact, a recent poll says 70% of customers believe that it is important for brands to take a stand on political and social issues. Now, meanwhile, a July poll by YouGov and the Cato Institute shows 32% of Americans fear that their political opinions could hinder their careers or worse, cost them their jobs. Now, combine that with an additional 31% of Americans think executives who donate to President Trump or his campaign should be fired, and 22% of Americans think executives who donate to Joe Biden's campaign should be fired. So where does that leave us, with 62% of Americans afraid to make their political views public, all while demanding companies and brands do just that, take a stand? So the result that we have is that media outlets and influencers who make their living by sharing opinions are at the risk of getting canceled for the slightest provocation, and brands afraid of getting caught in the crossfire feel they only have two options: stay silent and be called out for not taking a stance, or cease to advertise on media channels that may be the very thing that helps them keep the lights on. It's a no-win situation for businesses and for marketers. Hate, judgment, and shame are now pervasive in our culture. So we have got to find a way forward where businesses can flourish in an environment that allows differences of opinion to be heard and respected. We must find a way to discuss issues and disagree with respect in this country. It's time that we start the process of holding ourselves and our partners accountable for the profit we make from hate, yes, and also divisiveness, which descends from both sides. The politicians have made it clear they're not going to do this for us. So it falls to the business community to work with members of the media that they support to stand up and say, enough is enough. We can do better than this. It's time to work out our differences. If you work in marketing, media, or corporate America, I cannot think of a more important cause right now for you to be thinking about. So think of this podcast as a starting point. We're beginning with a conversation, but we're going to end with action. And our aim is simple: preservation of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness by bringing unity to these divided states of media. I want to tell you about an exciting development that's happened in our cause here. When I speak, I do so on behalf of my organization, which is Oxford Road. But this subject matter is a lot larger than the scope of any one agency, brand, or media platform. So we've joined forces with the National Institute for Civil Discourse, which is a nonpartisan organization that was actually founded by George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton with the goal of promoting healthy and civil political debate. We're going to be working together with the NICD to discover and assemble resources to help American brands and media entities find ways to solve the problems that divide us by providing a safer media landscape to do business while advancing common values in the process. And so to that end, I would like to introduce to you our first guest for the new series, Keith Allred. Keith is the executive director of the National Institute for Civil Discourse. He was recruited to lead after launching Common Sense American. And that's an organization that brings Republicans, Democrats, and independents together from across the country to find and champion solutions with broad support. Keith, just so you know, got a PhD from UCLA, a bachelor's in American history from Stanford. And just prior to that, Keith was the first professor of negotiation and conflict resolution at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. On top of that, he's a great guy and quite handsome, I'll have you know, if you're not watching on YouTube. So Keith, welcome.
Hey, Dan, good to be with you.
I'm really glad you could join us for this. Listen, we're going to cover a lot of ground today, so let's get right into it. Can you tell us what is the NICD?
Yeah, let me answer that by telling a little bit the origin story. The University of Arizona founded NICD in the wake of the Tucson shooting in 2011 that killed 6 and injured another 13, including Representative Gabby Giffords. And a part of that story that a lot of people don't know is that in the weeks just prior to the Tucson shooting, where Gabby was having that Congress on Your Corner event, Gabby had talked with the University of Arizona about her concerns with declining civility and bipartisanship in the Congress and in the nation at large, and was encouraging the university to think about a center or an institute or something to work on that. So the university was determined that that tragic event wouldn't be the last chapter in the story, and went ahead with Gabby's idea. And as you mentioned at the top, that was such a galvanizing experience. It really gave the university major convening power. So George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton were the founding co-chairs of the board. Also on the board are Christy Todd Whitman, Tom Daschle, Colin Powell, Madeleine Albright, Katie Couric, just a long list of people.
Heard of a couple of those people.
Yeah, who are, really willing to step up and put their reputations on the line to say, hey, we really do need to be able to engage our differences more constructively in this country. So, NICD got into this space pretty early. None of us knew just how bad things were going to get by 2020. And I think that's been important that we were able to establish ourselves and establish, a set of programs and resources as the challenge has gotten ever greater.
Thank you. And so talk to us a little bit about the state of civil discourse in America today, because it seems to be getting worse by the minute.
Yeah, well, I certainly would agree at how bad it is. I mean, just simply, it is bad. To put a little more texture on it and dimension, I'll draw a distinction between kind of polarization and incivility at the level of political elites, elected officials, et cetera, and at the level of everyday Americans. So I think that's an important distinction to draw. And at the level of elected officials and political elites, there's just overwhelming evidence that this is the most divided we have ever been in our history along partisan lines. Now, we've been more deeply divided along other lines in our past. We had a civil war, the civil rights era of the 1960s and the Vietnam era. We were deeply divided, but in those cases, it didn't break cleanly along party lines. What's unusual about this period in American history is the cleavage between the two parties. And just to give you one bit of, I'm a recovering professor, Dan, and I try to not relapse, but every now and then.
We'll accept it here. We like the history.
So one of the most compelling pieces of evidence on, just how historically high the levels of polarization are comes from some research that two political scientists did analyzing the more than 13 million roll call votes that have been cast in the Congress going back all the way to 1789. And they found a way to measure, you take, for example, how Senator Warren votes on a given roll call vote, who votes with her, who votes on the other side. And if you take all the votes that way, you can calculate mathematically the dimension that best defines the pattern of voting. And it turns out to be ideology, conservative to liberal, probably not surprisingly, going all the way back to the beginning. And you can take the average score on that dimension. So for the Republican Party and for the Democratic Party, or for their prior manifestations earlier in our history, and look at the difference between the averages between the two parties as a measure of polarization. Another way of saying it, it's a measure of just how party line is the voting. And if they call that the Polarization Index. And if you chart that difference in averages between the two parties, what you find is that the 114th Congress that concluded in 2016 had the highest level of polarization in 230 years under the U.S. Constitution. Literally broke the 2-century-old record. But the most disturbing thing is not just that it is literally the high watermark for polarization. It's that it is a 40-year trend line. It started in the 1970s, in the late 1970s, and has actually been accelerating. The differences, the degree of party line voting have been increasing, accelerating over time. And we've never had that before in our history. We've had spikes in polarization before, and then they've tended to come down as quickly as they spiked. We've never had a 40-year run-up of accelerating polarization. These are absolutely new waters for the American Republic, and I think they are a dire threat to our system of government.
Well, so yeah, go ahead, please. No, I want you to.
That's on the elites, and I was going to go to we as everyday Americans, but happy to pause there and talk about elites and political officials for a minute, if you.
No, please do, because I think this being our first episode on this topic, it's really helpful for all of us to kind of lay the foundation of where we're at and how we got here.
Yeah. So if you say, okay, that's political elites, but how does it look among us as everyday Americans? And here, political scientists have had to draw a whole new distinction in defining polarization that we never have before. And the distinction is between issues polarization. How far apart is the average Republican and the average Democrat, everyday citizens, on the particular issues of the day, versus social, or it's sometimes called affective polarization, meaning how mad are we at the other side? How much do we fear the other side? How much are we angry at the other side? And here's the really curious state of affairs, Dan. For a very long time, the level of issues polarization between average Republicans and average Democrats is quite low. If you get down to very specific policies across the board and ask, where Republicans and Democrats are, there is far more agreement than disagreement. And that's just looking at Republicans and Democrats. More than 40% of Americans consider themselves independents, and they always come out somewhere in between Republicans and Democrats in those surveys. And so issues polarization is quite low and has been for a very long time. It's increasing a bit now, but pretty moderately. In contrast, social or affective polarization is escalating rapidly. In other words, we're getting really mad at the other side, even though we agree on a lot. And so it's this very curious finding, and there's a lot of interesting research on why is it we're so mad at each other when we agree on everything. And here there's a couple of interesting connections, I think, Dan, to what you and we at NICD are going to try to do together. But let me start a little bit general. One of the reasons that we're so mad at each other, even though we agree on so much, is that we don't realize how much we agree. We have a perception that the difference is greater than it is. In fact, there's good research on this. We perceive about twice as big of a difference between Republicans and Democrats as actually exists. And of course, the media plays a pretty significant role in that. But it starts probably that the most extreme among us talk louder and longer, so they leave a much bigger footprint. They get covered more in the news media, they post more on social media, and so we're hearing from them disproportionately. And the large swath of us who are a little more moderate, a little more inclined to say, hey, let's deal with these differences a little more respectfully. We also tend to be quiet and we don't speak up as much. And then the news and the media amplifies that further. So that's a little bit, I think, the current state of civil discourse and polarization in America. And it's really not so much that we as the American people are so divided on issues, but that we perceive greater differences, and perceiving that the other side is more extreme than they really are, then we're getting really mad and doing more extreme things. And so then the other side does more extreme things, and we've got this kind of escalation dynamic going on.
So when you talk about the hate piece of that, are you suggesting that rather than this being a reflection of what the people want, at a grassroots level, that this is more of a top-down thing that is amplified by the media and kind of the reward cycle that gets them to keep pushing towards the loudest voices on the extremes? You're saying it's more top-down than bottom-up?
It is, and the research on that is quite good. You would find a few scholars who might disagree with that a bit, but the most of the consensus is that this has mostly been driven by elites. Now, there's a couple of layers here. In the first instance, the biggest reason that elites have led has not been, again, in the first instance, a diabolical effort to do it. It is a little bit of there's a lot of, we should just acknowledge it's complicated. We're a big, complicated country, and there's a lot of different forces at work. So it's hard to give one simple explanation for what's going on. But one of the really important forces is that starting again in the late 1970s, at the political elite level, the parties started to sort themselves ideologically for the first time in American history. For a set of odd historical reasons, in this country we have always had ideologically mixed parties. That is, there have been conservatives, moderates, and liberals in each party, going all the way back to the 1780s. In our lifetimes, we can remember when there were a lot of conservative Southern Democrats and Northern liberal Republicans. That started to change in the late 1970s, and it's complicated about why it started to change then. But in any event, it did start to change then, so that conservatives and moderates were no longer welcome in the Democratic Party, and liberals and moderates were no longer welcome in the Republican Party. But once you had that ideological sorting, I'd call that the kind of first order effect. There's all kinds of second order effects that gives rise to, including within the political system itself and the electoral system. It became the strategy of playing to your base as opposed to playing to the middle became much more effective as the parties sorted ideologically. And so politicians had an incentive to play to the base in a way they hadn't before. And so then they started doing that, and kind of throwing red meat and playing to the base became much more common than in the 1980s into the 1990s and now. And then that creates the conditions for which you have the political polarization of the media. In the 60s or 70s, we didn't have our own ideological news outlet like we do today. Mm-hmm. But the fact that sorting has happened makes that a better business model, frankly. So that happened starting in the late 1970s. The other thing that happened, really this social or affective polarization among everyday Americans started building in the 1990s. And it was kind of a follow-on to that ideological sorting. And the add-on was that a lot of our other kind of social identities began to become aligned with our political identity in a way they hadn't been before. So in the 1960s and 1970s, if you knew whether a person went to church every week, if you knew whether they lived in an urban or rural area, if you knew what race or ethnicity they were, it told you virtually nothing about what party they were. Today, it is highly, highly correlated. So we went from cross-cutting social identities where we might have a party identity, which might be a little bit different than our ideological identity, which might be a little different than our religious identification, which might be different from, whether we lived in rural or urban areas, to the, so that we knew people who were different than us on different dimensions, and it sort of inoculated us from thinking, oh, those people who have a different view than I are, the reason they do is because they're dumb or immoral. Because we knew people we had a kind of some sort of close affiliation with. So we know, hey, I disagree with them, but they're good people. Once you stacked all these social identities to be reinforcing each other, and we have less interaction with people that we feel some close connection to that have different views, then that ability to say, hey, the reason they disagree with me is because they're dumb or immoral, really gets amplified by these group identities. So it becomes a much more tribal us versus them. And that's what happened in the 90s. And I think that's what's really then trickled down into the business world, generally into the world of media and advertising and the cancel culture more specifically, is that there is such passion there to play to, you can build business models on that.
Right.
And so that playing to those kinds of passions became a viable business strategy in a way it hadn't been previously in American history.
So let's talk a little bit about that. So when you talk about the change that happened in the 90s, do you think the fairness doctrine going away had something to do with that, and some of the regulations easing up on consolidating media?
Yeah, I do think that contributed. It's hard to know kind of what's the chicken and what's the egg. They're kind of reinforcing each other. I tend to think that this ideological sorting first kind of gives rise to people don't feel as much of an interest or a concern in those, and so you let there be a little bit of a different policy going. The rise of social media, happens in this period also. So there's a number of, it feels kind of like a perfect storm. A number of other factors maybe encouraged, or the conditions created by the ideological sorting and what follows from it, but certainly reinforces it and escalates it.
So it's interesting, while you're explaining this, I just had the thought that, okay, if media has this incentive cycle for attention and revenue, and that trickles down, and now with social media, with the internet, everybody has their own talk show if they want it, right? However small the audience may be, it could be 100 people, couple hundred people, but you've got a platform now, you've got an audience. I wonder if every part of polarization online and in social media is just a microcosm of what's happening with the big networks and platforms.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think one of the ways it's a microcosm is, in social media, like on the larger networks, you're looking for eyeballs, you're looking for followers, right? And it's just easier to gin that up by, really playing to people's strongest emotions. And, it's an unfortunate aspect of the human condition that we have more and stronger negative emotions than positive emotions. We have anger and fear just really elicit behavior, motivate us to do things, in a way that, gratitude doesn't. Mm-hmm. And so if you're wanting to mobilize people, get people behind you, get followers, you play to anger and fear, and playing to that along the partisan divide is more effective now than ever in American history for the reasons we've talked about.
So this is a large undertaking that you've chosen as a profession. I can't think of a broader issue. So talk about the work that you do. Like, what's a day in the life for you, for the type of work you guys are doing before the initiative we're launching together, just NICD stuff?
Yeah. Well, first I'll say, my wife's commentary on my career is, she says, you go throw yourself in between people who are really mad at each other, you have a terrible career. And I remember saying this, like, yeah, maybe I should have.
I feel that way a lot, actually. I can relate.
Right. So for whatever twisted reason, Dan, both you and I seem to be drawn to try to do something constructive about it.
So glutton for punishment, there's a certain amount of
some,
just self Yeah, self-hatred
Something
probably
twisted.
motivates us to talk about these things.
Yeah, clearly some
Yeah.
twisted, defective part of our personalities. Clearly. Uh, yeah, so maybe I can answer that question primarily by way of talking about the programs that we do at NICD. So, as you say, it's a daunting task, to say how do we turn this tide and develop our capacity as a nation to engage our differences more constructively when it's going so hard, the tide's going so hard the other way. First, I just want to say we're pretty clear-eyed about that, about how difficult that is going to be to turn the tide. And so we try to be really thoughtful and disciplined about concrete, sustainable programs that we can scale to the magnitude of that problem. And so we've really been working on that scaling issue over the last couple of years, and are really delighted actually at some of the developments. And honestly, there's some very good news here, Dan. And so let me tell you about a couple of things we're working on, and kind of how surprised we are at how successful they're being. The first one you mentioned is this Common Sense American, which it's a program I founded. I piloted in Idaho, my home state, for 5 years, and then was launching at the federal level, and that's why NICD recruited me to come lead the institute. So, as you mentioned at the top, Common Sense American is a grassroots organization of everyday Americans from across the political spectrum and across the country who work together to identify and champion solutions wise enough that they can attract broad bipartisan support. So we do that through 4 steps. First, our members pick 3 issues per year that they think are the most promising to work on to find these kinds of solutions. Second, we develop really thorough policy briefs on each of those questions where we make the strongest case for and against each proposal in a given issue area. Third, each member commits to spending 90 minutes per year reviewing the brief that they get randomly assigned to and sharing their views, indicating whether they support or oppose each proposal in the brief. And fourth, then, they also commit to contacting their members of Congress to share their own views. So we don't take official positions on legislation as an organization. Each individual takes their own views, having had a chance to get well informed on it. But we do report the overall results. So we can show where there is consensus and where there isn't. And we share those results publicly and do briefings with Congress on the results. And then each of our members contact their members of Congress directly with their own views. So what has been delightful about this, I mean, I had this idea about 20 years ago and have been working on refining it, testing it in my home state of Idaho and refining it and then launching it at the federal level. And I can tell you that I've just blown away. So we launched the federal version of this a year and a half ago, the beginning of 2019, mid-January of 2019. We now have over 21,000 members and are on course to have 30,000 members by the end of the year. That's about 3.5 times the speed that we expected. In fact, it's accelerating. We had hoped to get to 3,000 members in the first year, and we got to 1,000. It's also been really encouraging to see the take-up across the country and across the political spectrum. So we're about 25% Republican, about 24% Democrat, about 45 to 47%, depending on the day, independent, and the rest other. So it's politically very balanced and from every state in the country.
Well, from what you're saying, that's really a good description of America. Is that correct?
It's exactly reflective of America. So it's completely balanced and reflective of the country. And I think that the fact that, and listen, this is really a digital play that we're making. You do it all online, you review your brief, you share your results, you email your members of Congress. The way we've recruited has been through social media. So we've identified in our conversations so far some ways in which the digital age has made polarization and incivility tougher. But these tools can be used to unite us as well as divide us, and we're really committed to that at NICD. And It's been mostly through a social media campaign that we have recruited, Americans to join this, and it's just been so encouraging to see the take-up, how much of a hunger there is in this country among everyday Americans for a different kind of politics, and a willingness to roll up their sleeve to do something about it. So that's one part of the encouraging point, is at the level of everyday Americans and how much.
Quick question on that. Is the value as much in the initiatives that you're advancing, or is it more like the moon landing, where it's the biggest win is just showing that it can be done?
Yeah, no, you're quite right, Dan. I mean, we pick issues that we think really matter. So the first one we worked on is surprise medical billing. This is where, if you get treated by an out-of-network doctor without your knowledge or consent, they can charge you essentially anything they want, and
Right.
they can send debt collectors after you and everything. So it's a big issue in this country, and we think that issue really matters. But it's equally, we want to demonstrate, hey, it's actually not that hard to identify sensible solutions that get broad support across the spectrum. The other part of this, Dan, that has been really a pleasant surprise, this has been an even bigger surprise for me, because I knew that there was a real hunger for this among everyday Americans. What has surprised me most is how much of a hunger there is in Congress for this. How much members of Congress are feeling the tug. They hear, again, disproportionately from the extremes and the special interests. And so, to a large extent, many of them are kind of forced into this in ways they don't really want to do. And they're just so grateful to hear of a large group of Americans organized this way to try to give some support for good bipartisan work. The work on surprise medical billing, for example, there's 6 excellent bipartisan bills in the Congress to end it. There's virtually no partisan divide on it. And they're just so grateful that we're organized this way. We have done over 100 congressional briefings in the last 6 weeks. Our capacity to do them has been the limit, not the hunger in the Congress to hear the results on surprise medical billing. So we've really been delighted with the uptick. I mean, there are clearly members of Congress not interested in doing business this way, but there's a lot more of them that are open to this than you might think watching the news.
Yeah, for sure. Now, Keith, earlier on, you mentioned cancel culture, and I recently did a Google search trends view of the word or the term cancel culture, and it's a hockey stick in the last few months, right?
Yeah.
So I think as you've been specifically with NICD, this thing has exploded. Can you talk about what it is from your view and what you think about it?
Yeah, in my view, it is this increasing inclination to say the best way to respond when I have a difference with someone else is to try to cancel them. And it can be cancel in the literal sense of I want to cancel a program, or it can be cancel in a little broader sense. I want them fired, I want them out, I just want them eliminated. And so that really has been spiking rapidly. And so I think two points I want to make here, Dan. One is, I think we ought to acknowledge that all of us, including the executive director of the National Institute for Civil Discourse, will draw a line somewhere where we say, hey, the tools of civil discourse aren't the appropriate tools in this situation. We will all draw a line with saying, hey, that individual or that group has gotten so extreme and so dangerous, we need a different set of tools than civil discourse. We all will draw that line somewhere. Just to draw the most obvious, I think, historical example of it, in 1941 or 1942, to say, well, let's sit down and listen with Adolf Hitler for understanding and make sure we understand his perspective. No, that wasn't going to work. It was never going to work. That was an evil actor, and appeasement did not work. It made things worse, and it was going to come to war, and we needed to be clear-eyed about that and do that. So I just want to note that we will all draw that line somewhere, and that we probably want to live in a society where we give each other a little bit of space to draw that line where our conscience and convictions say it should be drawn. I mean, I want to reserve that right for myself.
Yeah.
And I think most of us do. So that's one point. But the second point is to say there's a whole bunch about human nature that leads us to pick up those tools that are not the tools of civil discourse, that are more the tools of the cancel culture, way too prematurely, and that there's a lot of danger and blowback and unintended consequences from that even assessed from our own objectives, they often backfire on us. And part of the problem is that they escalate. So if we do it, then the other side does it. And then if the other side does it, then we do it more. And so it's not like typically if you bring your toughest cancel game, that the other side hangs their head in shame and says, oh, you caught me, I was wrong, I'm not going to do that anymore. Right? That's just not how human nature works. We're like, what? I've got a righteous cause here, I'm not going to put up with this. And then, and so we're in this escalation dynamic. And so we all, human beings are deeply social animals. From the time we were little kids, we have experienced that in the vast majority of cases, we ourselves are better off and we are collectively better off. We're better off individually ourselves and collectively better off if we err on the side of engaging differences constructively, that we treat others with consideration and respect. We see a fellow human being, a fellow American on the other side of a political divide or a political issue, not just the stereotype of an opposing view. We advance our own causes, but as a country, we are better off. The base of the Democratic Party and the base of the Republican Party are at best, I mean, you can argue a bit about where you draw that line, but are best about a third of the country, right? Both Democrats and Republicans are a minority of the country. More than 40% are independents. It is never going to work for 1/3 of the country to impose its will on everybody else. You can't impose it. You're going to have to persuade people to your view to do anything sustainable in this country. And that's quite purposeful. The founders, built in separation of powers and a big diverse republic for the express purpose of making it hard for any one party to impose their will on everybody else. So we're just going to hit our head against that wall. We can't realize the full promise of American self-government unless we engage differences more constructively than we are.
So I'm going to share an observation that I have, and I know you're attacking this problem more broadly, and we're pretty narrowly focused, especially on this program, for corporations, for media, for marketers who are really stuck in the middle on this, because the research that we're seeing says people want brands to take a stand on issues that matter. They want to reflect the values, and yet what you described earlier about you've got Hitler, who is evil, and we do not negotiate with a guy like Hitler. You have to create a boundary there. The problem is that people that identify as being more mainstream, just on one side or the other, seem to keep getting painted as evil.
As extreme.
Yeah, the right paints the left as evil, the left paints the right as evil, and I think there's a lot of us that don't feel like they have a home because they don't want to get involved in that. And so are you seeing it that way? And how on earth do you see anybody combating that?
Yeah, well, yes, I do. You're just in a no-win position if you're in business today, as we suck more and more into our political divide. That where we shop, what we watch, is subject to this political polarization, and if you're not with me, you're against me, kind of a mentality. And again, going back to this point that it is largely a misperception that at the level of the American population, most of us are not in those extremes, even though it looks like it. And that painting it as though that is the way is counterproductive for all of us, including to having a healthy, robust economy with vibrant businesses in it. So it is a really serious problem, Dan, and you and I have had some good discussions about it, and you and I aren't completely clear on what all the answers are yet,
Right,
but
right. We're working on it.
we're committed to say there's got to be some better alternatives than what we're doing now, and let's put some thought and some work in that and see if we can develop some resources and some approaches that will give us some alternatives to just manning the barricades in a cancel culture kind of way. Are there ways that we can honor our own convictions, what the dictates of our conscience tell us, but also treat others with some consideration and respect, and see if we can't come to resolutions and outcomes that aren't just doing battles to the death with each other?
And are you seeing from where you sit how this is impacting businesses across the country in terms of, the pressure for them to stand up on controversial issues, to pick a side, to get more political? Are you observing that happening?
Yeah, it's an interesting seat to occupy in my position, because you hear about it. Everybody emails you, we get calls, and so you hear about it. It's just remarkable the range at which you see this manifest. I mean, within families, within companies, so many people feeling like, hey, if I let people know what my political views are, it's really dangerous for my career. My job might be at stake. And that's new in this country. And I can't think that any of us like that development. You spend a lot of your waking hours at work going around feeling like, geez, if people knew how I felt, I might be in real trouble here. And is that going to leak out somewhere? That just can't be healthy for us as individuals, operating with, living within the organizations where we work, and the businesses in this country, for businesses themselves to succeed in this. I just can't think that that's really where we want to be as a country.
Amen. All right. So Keith, in just a minute, we're gonna play a little game, the unsolicited advice game, where you're gonna give a tweet-sized piece of advice from the Oval Office on down to different groups within this country. Before we do that, I really need to ask our audience to help us out with something that's very important to me. One of the things, Keith, you were talking about earlier is that we're all social creatures. We need connectivity. We need interaction. And one of the things that's, I think, even more pronounced since COVID hit is the sense of isolation that so many people have. One place that this has been a problem well before and well after coronavirus is occupying the headlines and still a threat is the fact that this happens every day at children's hospitals across America, where kids with life-threatening illnesses are alone in bed with no one to comfort them. And that's in spite of world-class medical care, devoted parents. The problem is just nobody can be there all the time. So you get these kids that are sitting there lonely, in many cases crying, with nobody to help them. When our youngest daughter was born with a number of life-threatening medical illnesses, she's doing great now, but we spent about 6 months by her side at Children's Hospital, giving her all the comfort that we could. But we saw this problem firsthand, and at the because of my wife, decided we were going to do something about it. So what we created was something called the Koala Corps, with the mission of trying to find hands to hold every child in need. And the interesting thing is, there's such an appetite for it. There are so many volunteers that want to help. The problem is that hospitals oftentimes don't have the budget to have somebody manage the program, to train, to vet, to manage, to screen, the volunteers. And so you have people that could help these kids. You have the kids that need the help. There's nobody in between. So that's what the Koala Corps is all about. And I want to ask you, if you're listening or watching today, to help us with this cause. The Koala Corps doesn't touch a cent. We just provide a platform for you to donate directly to this specific cause at Children's Hospital. And so I just want to ask you to visit koalacorps.com. That's KOALACORPS.com, koalacorps.com. Thanks for letting me do that. And if you like what we're doing here, please make sure you subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your shows. And you can also visit oxfordroad.com to subscribe to our weekly newsletter, The Influencer, to get industry updates and thought leadership. Okay, so Keith, it's
Hey, Dan,
time.
can I put in one plug while we're at it?
Oh, absolutely.
So would really encourage all of those listening to go to nicd.arizona.edu. There you'll find out all about Common Sense American, and you can join. We also have another program called Engaging Differences that is an opportunity to engage in productive ways and build some skills for engaging differences constructively. Whole bunch of resources there and concrete things people can do to try to help be part of the problem.
Thanks for sharing that, Keith. And if you've got any other plugs you need, save them, because I'm going to ask you again at the end. So sometimes you got to say it and then you got to say it again. Yeah. So all right. So with that, now you're going in the hot seat. So we're going to give you 20 seconds on the clock, and here's what you're trying to do. You're trying to give unsolicited advice in tweet-sized form that would help us find common ground and take one step closer towards unity. So the first person you're going to address, we're going to make this real easy on you, is President Donald Trump. So you got 20 seconds. Are you ready? Let's go.
Mr. President, we have to be able to agree that we want a fully functioning post office.
Very good. Very good. Okay, next up, you're going to talk to Joe Biden. So here you go. 1, 2, 3.
Joe, you've made a life and a career out of being a decent person. Don't let the pressures of the campaign change that.
Boy, you're really good at this. You're coming in under time and everything. Okay, now, marketers in America, people that are trying to figure out how to grow their business through different media efforts. You've got 20 seconds, so go ahead.
Ooh, that's it. I'll show you the magnitude of the problem. I feel like I'm stumbling more on that one. That's a hard one.
It's a hard one. It's a hard one. But see what you can do.
There is so much that we share as Americans, and throughout our history, businesses have been one of the voices to remind us of that. Don't forget that role.
Beautiful. You're doing great. You're doing great. Okay. Now, members of the media, whether in front of the camera, behind the camera. Ready? Let's go.
Okay, I'm gonna get specific here. Anderson, asking a political opponent to speculate on the motives of the other side is not newsworthy. I'm not interested in hearing it. Let's get away from that.
Beautiful. Okay. Now, all Republicans, on your mark, get set, go.
Republicans, you have always played a critical and honorable role in this country. It is important that you stick to your long-held values, which includes the importance of good character.
Wonderful. Okay, now we're going to talk to the Democrats. On your mark, get set, go.
The sincerity of your convictions is not license to treat everybody else who doesn't share them as evil and dumb.
All right, now, America across the board, every American. This is your big address, and they're all going to listen. So, choose your words carefully. Mark, it said go.
We as a people are less divided than our politicians, and we're more hungry for a different kind of politics. If we are going to turn the tide, the American people will be our saving grace.
This is good stuff. I'm voting for everything you say. Keith, I'm going to give you a bonus question now. I don't think we told you we were going to do this, but now here's the big one. If you could write in one person that would become the next president because you wrote them in, anybody alive today, who would it be?
Yeah, I genuinely stumble on that, and the problem is that the system has so warped everybody that there are very few people who have been in high office and had the kind of experience you would want them to have that haven't been so sullied by our system. And so I'm ducking a little bit the question.
I understand.
It's the biggest indictment of our system that it has so discouraged people of goodwill and people who really do want to work across the divides from running for office. And so
you get to draft them. Don't forget.
Yeah.
This is anybody.
Yeah, I don't have anybody obvious in mind. That's terrible that I'm ducking it, but
Do you mind if I write you in?
Yeah.
Can we do that?
I thought we were friends. You wouldn't wish that.
Yeah, but I need the help.
Yeah. I don't know.
All right, we'll let you set that one out. We'll take you out of that.
You know what? That I do think the inclination among Americans to not look narrowly at people who've had long political careers, I get. That's a bit of a tug I feel too.
Yeah, it's
military leaders and governors are kind of two of the places I'd look.
Yeah. Okay, so let's get back to the core conversation. And I want to move from, you did a great job helping us understand how we got here. Let's talk a little bit about where we're going. Where does change actually begin on this issue?
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned before, I think that the American people have to be our saving grace. We as a people have to step up. Once the parties have sorted, like we talked about, it's very hard to see how they go back. That conservatives become welcome in the Democratic Party, liberals become welcome in the Republican Party. And once that happens, I'm just not sure that they are really going to lead us out of the current mire that we're in. So I do think it is we the people that have to step up. And to remember, we're at the top of the org chart in a system of self-government. We hire and fire everybody, including the president and the Congress. And so we have got to step up in ways to make that happen. Common Sense American is one opportunity. Again, that's nicd.arizona.edu, where you
There you go. There you go.
And others. But there's lots of other organizations out there doing great work. There's a lot on the the election system. Ranked choice voting, money in politics. There's making the ballot more accessible. There's a lot of great initiatives out there at that level.
Do you want to plug any of those? Can you tell us about some of the groups that you're aligned with, at least philosophically?
I think Unrig the system is the full name for it, is a kind of an organizing space for lots of that work has to happen at the state level. Most election law is at the state law level. And so they're a really good kind of collection and resource for the various state things going on. And so there, if you go to Unrig, and I'm going to forget what their URL is.
That's all right. We can Google them.
Yeah. then you can find a lot of resources like in your state what's going on, what could gerrymandering,
Yeah.
ranked choice voting. There's lots of things there, and I think there is a lot that we need to do
Let
in
me,
how our system works.
yeah, yeah. No, and I see some groups doing that. There's Unite America and several that I
Yeah.
think are trying to work toward that. Um, and I do want to plug for everybody. Over the weekend, because it came out in the last couple of weeks, I just watched the documentary from Barry Levinson and I believe it's David Smick. Anyway, it's called Stars and Strife, STRIFE. Very good documentary with practical solutions, leaders from both sides, things like that. Okay, I have a question for you coming out of all this. Do you think we need to have a legitimate third party in this country? Is there any other way out of this?
Yeah, I'm really mixed on that. It is, if you look at all the obstacles between here and there to having a third party that contributes more to the solution rather than making it a bigger problem, which it could in lots of ways, it's very tough. I'm increasingly open to it as I see how bad things are, but there's a lot of ways it can have unintended bad consequences, I think, including potentially kind of dividing the vote and actually empowering the extremes more if they're not. If the third party isn't successful enough and it's just draining off votes in the middle, then you drive the two main parties even more to the extremes potentially. So there's a lot of downside there. That's why I did Common Sense American, to find some way other than a party by which people can get involved in politics and policy, where the whole point is to find solutions, policy solutions, wise enough to attract support across the partisan divide. And so that's a way where we don't have to try to figure out a platform across the board that we agree on, just on an issue by issue basis. Let's find solutions that'll work, and let's at least start there so we can get some practical solutions to some of the problems that ail us. The Congress is really broken. They really have a hard time getting to practical solutions rather than just having a partisan food fight. So I'll admit that's not going to solve everything. But it's the best thing I've been able to come up with. I think we're going to need lots of different things. I think we need that on issues. I think we need some election reform. I think we just need to reconnect across the divide. I'll mention another group that we're partners with and that we have a lot of respect for, and that's Braver Angels, braverangels.org. And it's various ways to engage across the red-blue divide in constructive ways. Another grassroots organization that's very good. I think it's going to take a lot of different things. I wish I had one silver bullet.
Don't we all?
And I honestly don't. I really wish I did. I spent, I'm paid. I spend all day, every day, and have for most of my career working on this problem, and it's a really tough problem. But I guess I'd say this, Dan, it seems to be the American way that we don't get serious about solving a problem until it's at crisis proportions. I really do believe that Americans are getting to that point that they are really concerned at the state of our politics, and so are much more willing to stand up and do something. That's been our experience at Common Sense America, and the kind of reception that we've gotten that's just blown away our expectations. I see it happening in lots of other efforts like ours. And so I don't know exactly the avenues, but I do think we as a people who are less divided than our politicians are getting fed up, and we're going to stand up and we're going to find ways to take it back, and we'll meet this challenge like we have every other challenge in American history.
Keith, as we look ahead, I think a lot of people are asking themselves, is this the end of America when we can't work together? Because, we've all heard divided we fall, but I'm a believer that it's true. What happens in this country if we just stay on the trajectory that we're on 20, 30 years out? We talk about this for climate. We don't really talk about sustainability of communication and sustainability of our ability to work together, right? And so what happens if this keeps
Well,
going?
it's a nice way to frame the question, Dan. Is this sustainable? And the clear answer to me is it is not. Um, it will, our system of government will not survive in its current form on this current trajectory. And that's not just here. It's worth taking the long view. The American founders took a long look at the 3,000 years of dozens of attempts at self-government that preceded the American Revolution, and they all failed. And the American founders knew that. And so they really studied that history because they wanted to know, well, why have they always failed? We'd better understand why and have a better answer, or we're going to suffer the same fate. And they overwhelmingly concluded that the reason was, they called it the spirit of party or the problem of faction. That as soon as you put the ultimate power in the people, people would divide themselves up into different groups, and the contention that ensued made the government so incompetent and unstable that it opened the door for authoritarianism to come back in. And that had happened just repeatedly for 3,000 years prior to the American Revolution. It was the main thing they were worried about. So history is quite clear. This undoes republics. This kind of division, it is the Achilles heels of republics. They don't survive this kind of. We have the most robust system in the history of the world to that problem of faction, as the founders called it. But it cannot sustain in this. George Washington, in his farewell address, said this when he had the maximum attention of the country as he was stepping down and announcing he wasn't going to run for a third term. He said, "Now, while I have your attention, let me warn you about what I'm most worried about." And it was the spirit of party. He said, that's what can take this down. And he was writing that to that generation and every succeeding generation. It, to use your words, Dan, is not sustainable this way. We will either figure out a way to turn the tide and engage our differences more constructively, or we will begin to erode what we think of as American self-government. It will go towards authoritarianism.
And does that come from inside? Is that China? How?
Well, that's if you read the Federalist Papers that the founders wrote to explain the federal Constitution, over 60% of them make an argument for the Constitution that it's a better defense against faction than other systems have been done. And they divide up many of the Federalist Papers by saying the problem with faction is, one, it exposes you to intrigue and manipulation by foreign powers. And the first 10 Federalist Papers are about that. And then secondly, it creates domestic problems so that the government becomes incompetent. And those two play off each other. So we become softer targets for foreign adversaries when we're torn up like this. So it's both and. It is the Achilles heels of republics. And so, I'll go back to that research I cited that roll call voting in the Congress is the most partisan, the most party line voting in American history, going back 230 years. These are dangerous waters we're in. I'm an American exceptionalist. I think American self-government is the great hope of the world. And if on our generation's watch, we had this republic handed off to us in much better shape than it is now. If we don't hand it off to the next generation in better shape, then shame on us. I know I'm going to go to my grave doing everything I can to improve our generation's work on this. Dan, I know you feel that. I know you feel that, towards your daughter. That's what it's going to take. All of us saying, we're just not going to tolerate that. We're going to find a way. And if we all step up and say, this isn't how we want it, this isn't the country we want, we got to do something different, we'll find a way. But we got to reach that conviction first.
It's a great place to close, but I don't want to do it yet because I have a couple more questions for you. But that was really helpful. Do you have a sense, are we talking decades that this thing will hold? Are we talking years? What's the time horizon?
Yeah, it's hard to predict. it's also hard for me to imagine that in less than certainly 5 years, probably less than 10 years, we'll have significantly turned it around. But sometimes change comes really quickly. There are these kind of step function changes when a critical mass is reached. I don't think there's been a time in our lifetimes when the future seems so fluid. I think it is very hard for anybody to predict. I think the main thing you can predict, again, to use your very good word for it, is it's not sustainable. Something will give, one way or the other. Something will give. This is not sustainable, and it might escalate really rapidly and then really galvanize us. I'm guessing it's a little more of a long game, but if things are this bad or worse 10 years from now, I'm pretty sober about our future.
Mm. And so you're a historian. You've heard the story, true or not, that they ratify the Constitution. Benjamin Franklin walks out and they go, "What kind of government did you give us?" And he says, "Of course,
a republic, if you can keep it."
Is this what he was talking about?
This is exactly what he was talking about. And again, read the Federalist Papers, read George Washington's farewell address. The main theme in all of them is spirit of party, problem of faction is the gravest threat to republics, and we have responsibility. Spirit of party, that George Washington's farewell address was really aimed at everyday Americans doing their part, saying, you have to understand this about self-governments. You have to understand that it's in politicians' interest to play us off each other. This is, in 1796 that Washington is saying this. This is endemic to self-government and the human condition. Whether it's Benjamin Franklin saying, if you can keep it, whether it's George Washington's farewell address, whether it's Madison, Hamilton, and Jay in the Federalist Papers, they were all warning us, hey, citizenship in a republic is advanced citizenship. It's tough. It is hard to pull off self-government. There's a reason we went 3,000 years without being able to pull it off. It's that hard. American citizens, as a citizen, you have to play your role for it to work. And core to that, as the founders wrote extensively, is that we not let ourselves be played by politicians trying to play us off of each other. We have that responsibility, and it won't work without that.
Okay, so I want to bring this back to the core person that's listening here, which is probably a marketer. And you had 20 seconds earlier, but in as long as you have, imagine you're in the seat of somebody whose job it is to grow a business, and you find that the channels that you're dependent on, whether that is Facebook, whether that is Fox or CNN, talk radio, a lot of different podcasts, the more polarizing, the more successful they are, the more they're going to grow. And yet they're, as we talked about, under tremendous pressure. We talked about cancel culture on the other side of it. What advice could you give to them so that they can hold their head up high and know they're not being part of the problem, but are faced with choices about, grow or flee? What do you say?
Well, I think I would say, you can feel a little frozen in the current environment, and like anywhere you move, you're going to be had. I would just say, you also have a lot of power. You really, businesses depend on this kind of marketing. So businesses and their marketing representatives have a lot of power. So find ways to reach out in all directions. And, where you're going to do advertising, to say, look, we believe in free speech in this country. We believe in you being able to express the convictions of where your conscience leads you. Where it becomes a problem is when that articulation of your convictions leads to denigrating everybody else. And come up with some of those lines. I mean, this is what you and I are going to try to work on together, Dan. But identify for yourself some lines that are American lines. This is what we believe in as Americans, and reach out to the programs that you're going to advertise on and say, listen, we'd like to continue to support you. We'd like to advertise with you, but there's some criticisms that are being made of you that are legitimate. Could we hear a few of them? Could you at least have some guests on that have a different perspective and treat them decently? You're not saying that you have to muzzle yourself, but let other people speak and treat them respectfully. For those who are going to, on the cancel culture side of it, similarly sort of reaching out to that and say, look, we're interested in all legitimate views having a place in this country. So I actually think that marketers, that businesses who are doing advertising really can be part of the solution. You wield some power that the rest of us don't. And so don't get into a bunker mentality out of fear. Recognize the kind of power that you have and what you might be able to do. Probably a little hard, even if businesses, marketers have more power than the rest of us. Alone, you may not have enough power to move the needle, so you may need to join together to do it. But there is a lot of power there. And in a area where this polarization is being manifested that really matters, that gets a lot of attention, and so you really can be part of the problem, I think, and realize the power that you have.
Yeah. Well, and that's the journey you and I are on together. Final question, because I think a lot of people listen and think, I love the concept. I don't know if anybody will actually do it. And I know that Common Sense American is a good example of people working together across the aisle to solve problems. Are there any high profile figures, either in media or in politics, where you have seen this manifested in real life?
Yeah. Let me give you just one very concrete example. There's lots of them. We don't have time to go through them. But in the Congress on this surprise medical billing, you've had really some very impressive figures there. Senator Bill Cassidy, Republican from Louisiana, working with Democratic senators, Maggie Hassan from New Hampshire, and others, Senator Bennett from Colorado, started a bipartisan working group to say, hey, this is not okay that in this country people can be treated by an out-of-network provider without their knowledge or consent and then charged whatever. It's just not okay. We got to do something about it, and really started doing good work. That kind of kicked off the conversation. Representatives Chairman Pallone and Chairman Walden on the House side have really helped pick that up. On the Senate side of the committee, the Chairman Alexander and Ranking Member Senator Patty Murray. There's a real group of, I don't know, I'd probably call it 10 or 12 leaders in the Congress who have done really good substantive work, really good bipartisan work. There are leaders trying to, I'd highlight the Problem Solvers Caucus, a group of 25 Republicans and 25 Democrats in the House, who this is their whole point, is to work across party lines to solve problems. So there really are leaders out there trying to do it. The fact that we don't hear about it as so little, gets back to much of the theme here, is that's not what the news wants to cover, right? But it really is happening to a remarkable degree, and they can't get traction and they can't get things done unless we step up and support them. So they have got to get support. Again, that's what Common Sense American is what we're for. But we have got to step up and support those leaders with our votes, with our support on policy, reaching out on policy, talking to others. Those out there exist, and they just aren't getting enough airtime and support.
Okay, so Keith, it's time for us to wrap up. Are there any final plugs, either to repeat or new ways that people can get involved with you?
Well, again, I'll emphasize the point that it's going to be we the people that will be America's saving grace. And so at NICD, we really are trying to provide those opportunities. So if you go to nicd.arizona.edu, and there you can find out about Common Sense American and Engaging Differences and Golden Rule 2020, a call for dignity and respect in politics. There's just a number of opportunities that folks will find there, and I hope they'll go on the website and join us in being part of the solution.
And as you and I, Keith, go down this journey with our teams to try to figure out solutions for brands and marketers, I just want to encourage everyone to stay close to this program because this is kind of our home base. We will be launching a website and having more concrete steps that people can take as we go down the journey. But we've got a lot to learn, a lot to discuss. So Keith, thank you not just for your time with us today, but thank you for giving your life to this. This cannot be an easy sacrifice as a full-time gig. So, you know, to you, to your family, we're very grateful that you're out there doing the work that you're doing, and just so honored to be in partnership with you.
Dan, thank you very much, and thanks for having me on the program to kick this off, and really looking forward to what good we might be able to achieve together.
Thank you, Keith. This show is dedicated to the notion of e pluribus unum, out of the many, one. We believe that we can work through our differences without deepening divides and value welcoming perspectives that are different from our own. Thank you for joining us as we embark on the long road to national recovery and sustainable discourse. As always, if you found this helpful, please subscribe to iTunes, the Divided States of Media, Spotify, or wherever you get your shows, and please visit oxfordroad.com to subscribe to The Influencer, our weekly newsletter for industry updates and thought leadership. Also, thank you to Bianca, Kyle, Jennifer, the team at WIT, and everybody else who helped make this happen. We have a republic. Let's try to keep it.